Dear learners, welcome to this session. Today we are going to discuss about information sources categorization. Myself Dr. Archana Shukla from Faculty of Library and Information Science, School of Social Sciences, IGNOU. This categorization is from the very first unit of your course BLI 222, Information Sources and Services. In this topic, we are going to discuss about information sources and how these information sources are categorized. After watching this video, you will be able to explain how information sources can be categorized, describe that there are specific criteria for categorization of information sources, and identify sources by type, content, media and publication status. So, we are having two components here, information and information sources. We all know that in today's world, information has been very essential for all of us. We all need information for different purposes. A researcher and a scientist needs information for doing his or her research work. A manager needs information for decision making and smooth functioning of the organization. A teachers need information for teaching and learning process. So, this way our information needs are diverse. This information is also generated through various types like imagination, reasoning and experience through our sensory organs. The information generated was generally communicated to the others for their own interest and survival. Means there are two processes, one information generation and the other process is how this information, how this generated information is communicated to the society for their use, for the users, for their information needs. We all are familiar with different type of sources like printed sources like books, newspapers, magazines and other similar sources. Similarly, we have seen some handwritten documents also like manuscripts in the olden time. Then still now we are having letters, notes in the written format or we may say in the handwritten format, and we have electronic sources also like databases, microfilms, and nowadays we are having e-books, e-journals and many other type of electronic sources. So, here we see we are having two things, we are having information and we are having information sources. Now, the question may arise, why we need these information sources? We need these information sources to provide different types of information to the users. Why? Because as LIS professionals, we are not knowing about each and every information. What we are knowing? We are knowing about the different type of information sources from where we are going to get information for our users. So, the information sources or the sources from where we get information are called information sources. Like we have these information sources in the form of documents, we have these information sources in the form of humans, we have these information sources in the form of institutions, and we have information sources as mass media or in today's world in the form of World Wide Web or internet also. So, we are getting information from everywhere, from documents, from humans, from institutions and from mass media. These information sources, they evolved over a period of time. We all know that first printed books, these came into being. This is after the invention of the printing press. The other source after books which became popular is periodicals. After books, most of the researchers, scientists, they are mostly using periodicals, and the research literature is published in the form of periodical publications. Then after that, after the invent of internet and World Wide Web, electronic sources, mass media, internet and World Wide Web, they became the chief sources of information. So, we are going to discuss about categorization, how the categorization will help us in knowing about these information sources. See, when talking about information sources, I just told you that a source which is providing us information is known as information source. This information source is generally basically categorized into two types: documentary sources of information and non-documentary sources of information. Means documentary sources which are in the form of some document, non-documentary sources of information which are not available in the form of a document. Further seeing this division, it becomes clear that documentary sources of information are divided according to their content and form. According to their content, they are primary, secondary and tertiary, and according to their form, they are paper based and based on other media like CD, DVD, whatsoever the case may be. Similarly, non-documentary sources of information are also there like humans, institutions, mass media and internet. So, this is the whole categorization basically on which we are going to discuss today. Now, first coming to the documentary sources of information. All sources in the form of document are documentary sources of information. Whatsoever we are seeing in the form of document is a documentary source of information. Document, it may include a book, a periodical, a manuscript, a videotape, a computer file or even a database. Anything that is documented, that is available in the form of a document is known as a documentary sources of information. So, this way it becomes clear to us that all recorded sources of information, irrespective of their contents and forms, come under documentary sources of information. These may be published or unpublished. For example, manuscripts, they are not published, but still they are a documentary source of information. Sometimes these sources are in print or sometimes in electronic format. For example, a book, it can be a printed version or it can be a e-book. So, documentary sources means just that it is available in a form of a document. Then comes our non-documentary sources of information. As we have just discussed, there are three types of non-documentary sources of information: humans, organization or institutions, mass media and World Wide Web. Humans, we are having scientists, researchers, teachers, information generators. They are generating information, they are creating that information and they are providing that information to the society for their use. So, this way humans are the important source of information, but unless that information is not documented, the human, the person itself is a non-documentary source of information. Similarly, organizations, like we know different government organizations, non-government organizations, libraries, museums, archives, all of them, they are generating different type of information. So, institutions and organizations, they also act as a important source of an information. Mass media, this is not only the medium to communicate the information. Mass media itself generates information and they provide information to the users. So, mass media is also a non-documentary source of information, and at last in this category is World Wide Web or Internet, from where also we are getting different type of information. Now, coming to the categories, different categories one by one. If you remember that chart which we have discussed earlier in this discussion, we have seen that according to the content, information sources can be categorized into three: primary sources of information, secondary sources of information and tertiary sources of information. Primary sources of information are those sources of information which report any information for the first time. Means any new information, any research based information, any latest information which is first time published in an source is known as primary source of information. So, here we are going to categorize this according to the content, means which type of content is available in this source. Then comes our secondary sources of information. These secondary sources of information, they derive their information from the primary sources. Means first primary sources get published and after that secondary sources came into existence to provide the compiled information, to provide the consolidated information according to the needs of the user to them in the form of a secondary source. So, this is not the new, this is not the latest information. So, we are providing this information for the second time, means we are compiling and providing this information to the users from the primary sources of information. That is why they are known as secondary sources of information. Then comes the tertiary sources of information, means these tertiary sources of information, they are deriving their information both from primary and secondary sources, means they are compiling the information from primary and secondary sources. They are third in the category, that is why they are known as tertiary sources of information. Remember, this categorization is based upon the content which are provided in the documents, whether the contents are primary, whether the contents are secondary, whether the contents are secondary and tertiary. Then coming to the primary sources of information. Primary sources are those sources which contain original material that has been published, reported or recorded for the first time. Many examples are there for primary sources like periodicals, we call them primary periodicals also, then technical reports, thesis and dissertations, what we are doing for our PhD or MPhil dissertations. For thesis, for PhD we are doing our thesis, and for MPhil we are writing a mini thesis, that is known as dissertation. Then in the conferences, researchers are presenting their research work in the form of conference papers or research papers. Then comes the patents and standards, because they are also having new and new kind of a research is there, a new kind of a information is there which is going to be patented or standardized in the form of these patents and standards. Then comes our secondary sources of information. These are mainly dependent on primary sources for their existence, means a source which is more or less completely dependent on primary source for its existence is a secondary source of information. Why? Because they are compiling the information, they are providing the information collected from primary sources of information. Information in secondary sources is organized and arranged according to a definite plan. These secondary sources of information, they are also further divided into 3 types. First is index type. In this type, we are having indexes. You have seen index. We all are familiar with the index which is given generally at the back of the book. Then we are having bibliographies. Bibliographies, these are the list of publications, list of documents. Then we are having indexing and abstracting periodicals, and we are having current awareness services also, which comes under the category of secondary sources. So, first categorization in secondary sources is of index type. Then the second categorization is of survey type. In this, these publications survey the literature of a subject from various points of view and bring out another set of publications. For example, books, textbooks, treatises, review, state of the art reports. For example, if we take textbook, we all know that these textbooks are compiled according to certain curriculum or syllabus. So, what we are doing? We are compiling the already available information in a packaged format for our students. That is why which kind of information source it is? It is a secondary source of information. Similarly, take another example, that is review. A scientist or a researcher wrote an article reporting the findings of his or her research. What the reviewer is doing? Reviewer is reviewing that research article. So, what kind of a publication is this? That periodical article, that research article is a, what it is a? It is a primary source of information, and its review, where it comes under the secondary source of information. Then comes the third type of secondary sources. These are known as reference type. Reference means you are not going to read these documents completely. You are just referring these documents whenever the need arises. Based upon the queries of the users, you are referring these sources and providing different information to the users. In this category, we are having encyclopedias, we are having dictionaries, we are having biographical sources, we are having geographical sources, we are having statistical sources of information, then we are having yearbooks and annuals. So, many sources are there in this category. This category is exclusively for reference. In libraries, you see in this category, for keeping the resources of this category, we are having a different reference section also, where these reference sources are kept, and these sources are not for issuing to the users. These sources are just for the referring. Users come to the library and refer these sources according to his or her need. Then comes our tertiary sources of information. First primary, then secondary, then tertiary. As I told you, these tertiary sources of information, they are based on primary and secondary sources. Means in secondary, the data is compiled from primary, but in case of tertiary, the data is compiled from both primary and secondary sources, and these tertiary sources are based upon primary and secondary sources, and they serve as key to the primary and secondary sources. Means whenever you are going to find some information from the primary or the secondary sources, then you have to search the tertiary sources to know about the primary and secondary sources. For example, a bibliography of bibliographies is there. In secondary sources, we have discussed about a bibliography. What is a bibliography? I told you a bibliography is a list of books. And what is a bibliography of bibliographies? A bibliography of bibliographies is a list of bibliographies. Suppose in secondary sources, we are having so many bibliographies on our topic or on our subject area or on our topic of interest. So, how we will know about these bibliographies in our interest area? We have to consult some bibliography of bibliographies to know about the bibliographies available in the particular subject. Similarly, we are having guides to the literature. These guides help us to know about the already published literature. Bibliography of bibliographies, they tell us about the list of books. Similarly, we are also having periodical directories which tells us about the listing of periodicals available on a particular subject or on a particular topic. So, this way tertiary sources are compiled from primary and secondary sources. Always remember this primary, secondary and tertiary. This categorization is based upon the content of the documents. Then come our print sources. So, first categorization is based on the content. Now, this categorization of these documents is based upon the form of publication, whether they are available in the print format or not. These sources which are available in print format means they are available as a printed book, as a printed periodical or a patent or a standard or a conference document or a souvenir or a fast script or a report or an article. Anything that is printed is known as the print source of information. Then the sources which are not available in the printed format, like manuscripts, they are handwritten documents, they are not printed. We are having diaries, we are having letters, we are having files, office files, we are having laboratories notebooks, we are having databases, we are having humans, organizations, internet, our thesis, all these things they are not the printed, means those are not formally printed or published by a publisher. Those are known as the non-print sources of information. Other categorization is based upon the publication, whether they are published sources of information or unpublished sources of information. These sources are documentary sources, both printed and non-printed. They are bought out by publishers in large number of copies, usually priced and sold. The examples are like books, periodicals, patents, standards, conference documents, video recordings, souvenirs, fast script databases also. Then similarly, we are having unpublished. See, this unpublished category is somehow near to the unprint, non-print material which is non-printed. In this category, we are having manuscript, thesis, project reports, diaries, letters, memorandum, medical records, etc. So, these are the ways of categorization. According to the content, we categorize them into primary, secondary and tertiary. According to the print, we categorize them into print and non-print. According to the publication standard, we categorize them into published and unpublished sources of information. So, these are the ways which help you to know how these documents are categorized and how you are going to use these information sources for your users. For example, if a researcher needs information, which source you would like to consult? because a researcher needs which type of information? A researchers always need information that is latest, that is new in nature. So, which type of source you will consult? You will consult primary sources of information for providing information to a researcher. See another example, if the researcher wants a list of documents available in his or her area of interest, then what you will use? You will consult a bibliography, that is a secondary source of information. And for knowing about the bibliography, which source you will consult? You will consult bibliography of bibliographies to know all the bibliographies available on that topic. So, this way this categorization helps us to know about the different type of information available in different type of information sources and how these information is useful to our different users according to their needs, according to their requirement of the information. Then some other categorization is also there, like Dr. Ranganathan, Dr. S.R. Ranganathan, the father of library science in India. He conceived the idea of macro documents and micro documents. Documents such as books are macro documents. Those like journal articles are micro documents. Means a document which is providing a overview kind of information is known as a macro document, and a document which is providing a in-depth type of information is known as a micro document. These document can be in any form, it can be a microfilm, do not get confused with a microfilm to a micro document. Microfilm may contain a book, a periodical article, anything. Content is different and the form is different. Then comes the other categorization. This is non-conventional and conventional sources of information. This term is also given by Dr. S.R. Ranganathan. Conventional means which type of documents which we are using from a long time, like books, like periodicals. These are known as the conventional sources of information. And if we talk about non-conventional sources of information, like databases, computer files, e-books, e-documents, e-journals, anything which is available in the non-conventional format is known as the non-conventional sources of information. So, these are the basic type of categorization, how we are going to categorize information sources. You saw today in this discussion, we have first divided the information sources according to the content, then their print status, then their publication status, and the two categorization given by Dr. Ranganathan, like macro documents and micro documents, and conventional and non-conventional documents. So, this whole categorization will help you to know about the different categories of information sources which is available there for the libraries to collect their collection, to have in their collection and to provide different services to the users of the library. I hope after this discussion you will be able to know about the different categories of information sources and you will be able to identify the contents, form and publication status of the documents, how they are categorized. Thank you. Happy learning.